Well, hello there folks, this is Liaj and welcome to a video for Monster Hunter Rise. Today we have a video that I have been planning to make for a while, but it seems that now is perhaps the perfect time for it. So let's start with a bit of context. At the time of making this video, it seems that the version 3.0 update for Monster Hunter Rise has been announced to be scheduled for the end of May. As of right now, none of the monsters that will be contained in the update have been announced, but that is actually what brings us to this video. For this video, I thought that it would be neat to do some speculation on what sort of monsters we will see in future updates for Monster Hunter Rise. Now of course we will probably see some completely original monster designs in the upcoming updates, but it is more than likely we will also see the addition of returning monsters from past games. With that said, I would like to take some time to discuss the potential returning monsters that may be brought into the game. While there are many potential picks for returning monsters, the ones that I will be listing in this video are ones that I think have a good reason to be added to Monster Hunter Rise. I will be listing 10 monsters that I think actually have decent reasons to be added, and also add in a few honorable mentions that I think would be less likely but are still ones that I would like to see. Now before we get started, I would like to give my thoughts on the content of future updates, which will be relevant to which updates we may see certain returning monsters in. So as we do know, the only confirmed future update for Monster Hunter Rise is the version 3.0 update. All we know about this update so far is that it will include the addition of more monsters and a new ending for the game. Now when it comes to the content of this update, I do have to say that a lot of the monsters I will list will likely not be in this update. The reason for this is that it is most likely that the 3.0 update will continue to expand upon the game's endgame. Since we know that the update will include a new ending, we will likely see what will be considered the new final boss. In addition, it is likely that any additional monsters will also expand upon the endgame content. I could be wrong about this, but in the case of the updates for Monster Hunter World, we almost never saw the addition of monsters in updates that did not serve the purpose of expanding the endgame content. This makes sense because the addition of early or mid-game monsters post-launch would only result in players who have reached the endgame not wanting to hunt the new monsters. Now there is, however, one viable way to add early to mid-game monsters, and that would be with the release of a new rank of quests. For Monster Hunter World, we got the Iceborne expansion, and with a whole new rank of quests, we were able to see many new and returning monsters that would have not had a place in the base game's endgame. For many of the monsters I will list, if we were to see them added, their most likely scenario would be in an Iceborne scale update for Rise instead of in the base game's title updates. Now with all this in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our list. The first monster on our list will be the Flying Wyvern Gravios. Now as a quick note, I am not listing these monsters in any particular order, but of the ones that I will be listing, I think that Gravios is one of the top contenders to be added at some point. So let's talk about this monster. Gravios is a large flying wyvern that is essentially covered in rocks. If you have never seen this monster before, you may still find it looking rather familiar. This is because Gravios is considered to be the adult version of the monster Basarios, which is a monster that is in fact present in Monster Hunter Rise. The signature move of Gravios is a highly powerful heat laser, which is a move that you may have seen Basarios use on occasion. You may have noticed that when Basarios performs this move, it will sometimes not actually trigger, which reflects the fact that Basarios hasn't gained full control over it. When I saw that Basarios was in Rise, I was actually quite surprised at the fact that Gravios was not present. So far in every game before Rise, there has not ever been an instance where Basarios has appeared without Gravios, which is why I found it surprising that we haven't seen Gravios in Rise. This is also my main reason why I think Gravios has a very high chance to be added in a future update. Next up, we have the Lava Leviathan Agnator. Like Gravios, this is another monster with a juvenile form already present in Monster Hunter Rise. Unlike Gravios, however, the juvenile form of this monster is not a boss monster, but is instead the small monster Uraktor. Now, because Uraktor are only small monsters, I would put the odds for Agnator showing up to be a bit lower than those of Gravios. The reason for this being that both Gravios and Basarios are large monsters and share a lot of behavior. In the case of Agnator, however, the small monster Uraktor is hardly able to compare to the adult version. Now, to give a quick rundown of the monster itself, Agnator is a Leviathan type monster that inhabits volcanic areas. This monster was introduced in Monster Hunter 3, which was the first game to introduce the Leviathan monster types, which were traditionally water-based monsters. Instead of swimming through water, however, the signature feature of Agnator is that it essentially swims through the volcanic rock. This is done with the help of its beak, which it uses somewhat like a drill by spinning its body around as it swims. Interestingly, Agnator also has the ability to fire a heat beam just like Gravios, which I think is even more of a reason to add both monsters to the game. Imagine, the monsters could have a turf war where they both fire their heat lasers at each other, creating an epic beam struggle. Now that would be awesome. And now let's bring up an honorable mention. If Agnator is added to the game, there might be a chance of adding another Leviathan monster. This would be the flagship monster for Monster Hunter 3, Legiacris. Being a Leviathan like Agnator, Legiacris shares a handful of animations with it, so there is the possibility of both monsters being added. However, unlike Agnator, Legiacris is first and foremost a monster that was created for underwater combat. Now, this doesn't mean Legiacris is incapable of fighting on land. In fact, there was the Legiacris subspecies Ivory Legiacris that had a moveset geared almost completely towards fighting on land. In addition, Legiacris has also made an appearance in the Monster Hunter Generations games, which did not have water combat, and its land-based moveset was updated to have more of a focus on its lightning-based attacks. That said, even with these changes, the fight has always felt rather sluggish on land. With the improved mobility in Rise, this might be even more exaggerated, which is why I don't think that this monster would be the best fit for the game unless it receives some major revisions. Okay, our third entry on the list is the amphibian type monster Tatsu Cobra. Now once again, this is a monster that has a juvenile form in Rise. Well, technically. While not an actual monster in the field, you may recognize this monster's juvenile form from the Gathering Hub of all places. As it turns out, the pet monster that Guildmaster Hojo is using as a mount is most definitely the young form of Tatsu Cobra. Anyways, concerning the adult Tatsu Cobra, aside from the tie-in to the juvenile version, I think this monster has some good thematic reasons to be included in Rise. For starters, this monster shares a theme with a monster already present in Rise, which would be Tetranodon. As it turns out, both of these monsters have moves heavily inspired by sumo wrestlers. While you could say this is a good reason to not include the monster, I do think that it would be really neat to see, as the two monsters could then have sort of a rivalry going on, which could be reflected in something like a turf war. In addition, when it comes to the gear made from the Tatsu Cobra, a lot of the designs have a heavily Japanese theme. Now, by no means would this influence whether a monster would be added to the game, but I am quite a big fan of the way these designs look, so I would love to see them in Rise. Moving on to number 4, we actually have a monster that design-wise shares a lot of features with Tatsu Cobra. This is the amphibian monster Zamtrios. For starters, if we were to see Tatsu Cobra added, it could be likely to see this one as well simply because of their similar designs. In addition, this is once again a monster that already has a juvenile form in the game. These are the small monsters known as Zamite. Listen, I promise not every monster on this list will be one with a juvenile form in Rise. Now concerning Zamtrios itself, this monster just has a really cool design overall. Zamtrios is a giant shark-like monster that lives in icy areas. One cool feature of this monster is that it can cover its body in this jagged ice armor for quite a vicious look. However, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, Zamtrios can also puff up its belly to turn into a massive ball, which makes it look quite silly. Funnily enough, this also makes the monster somewhat similar to Tetranodon. Perhaps between Zamtrios and Tatsu Cobra, Tetranodon could be gaining 2 new rivals. Alright, so for number 5 I have a bit of an interesting pick. This is the flying wyvern Astalos. Now for those unfamiliar with this monster, let's talk a little history. In the game Monster Hunter Generations, there was a set of monsters known as the Fated Four, which this monster was a part of. These 4 monsters were considered the flagship monsters of the game. Now since Generations, we have seen the reappearance of 2 of these monsters. The first of these monsters was Glavenus, which appeared in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. The second was Mizutsune, which we have seen featured in Monster Hunter Rise. Now that leaves 2 of the monsters that we have not seen return yet. Perhaps with the release of a major expansion to Rise, we might have just the opportunity to see one or both of the remaining Fated 4 be added. Out of the remaining 2 Fated 4, the one that I think has the higher chance of being added is Astalos. For the design of Astalos, we have a somewhat standard flying wyvern design, which I feel would make for a slightly easier addition to the game when compared with the other option. I'm also just a big fan of this monster in general, having a really pretty glass-like design on its wings, combined with the ability to make parts of its body glow with electricity. Let's also real quick bring up the final member of the Fated Four as an honorable mention, the monster Gammoth. This monster is basically, as the name suggests, a mammoth, and it is quite massive. Out of the Fated Four, I would say that this monster maybe has the least conventional design. While this makes the monster quite interesting, I do feel that its massive size and unconventional design might make the monster a bit harder to implement in Rise, which is why I would give it a lower likelihood to be added. In addition, this monster was also announced for Monster Hunter Stories 2, while I don't believe the same is true for Astalos. Of course, we may very well see Astalos being added to Stories anyways, since we don't have all the information yet. If not, however, we could then say that Astalos is the only Fated 4 member not featured since Generations, which means that it could be more likely to be added in a Rise DLC. Up next at number 6, we have another flagship monster, the flying wyvern Serejos. Some of you folks watching might have been hearing me throw around this term flagship monster and are wondering what exactly that means. Well, basically, if you are unfamiliar, Each game in the Monster Hunter series has always had one monster that is featured prominently in the game's marketing material, and this monster also often plays an important role in the game's story. For Monster Hunter Rise, our flagship monster was Magna, and for Monster Hunter World, this was Nergigante. Now when it comes to bringing back returning monsters, I would say that these flagship monsters often have slightly higher odds due to already being quite iconic. For the monster Serejos, this was the flagship monster for Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. Design-wise, Serejos is a flying wyvern with the unique feature of being covered in razor-sharp scales that can be fired out as projectiles. One of the coolest features of this monster was with its gear, which provided very sharp weapons that would automatically sharpen themselves when you dodge. Out of the past flagship monsters that are currently not in Rise, I would give Serejos some pretty decent odds at being added due to its relatively straightforward design. For number 7, I would like to bring up one more flagship monster, Gore Magala. This monster, which is technically a juvenile elder dragon, is the flagship monster for Monster Hunter 4. Design-wise, the Gore Magala has an elder dragon skeleton with 4 legs and 2 wings, but its wings can also double as arms, giving it a total of 6 limbs. This monster also has an adult version known as Shigaru Magala, where the monster sheds its skin to reveal shining gold scales, giving the monster line a pretty cool light versus darkness dichotomy. There's even a version of this monster where it fails to shed completely, resulting in a half light, half dark version, and it ends up becoming more vicious than both of them. Out of all the flagship monsters that we haven't seen added, I think this is one of the most interesting ones, which is why I think it would be really neat to see it return. Between this monster and Serejos, I would probably give Serejos a slight edge due to its more simple design, but Gore is definitely a monster I'm sure a lot of folks would like to see return. Rounding out potential returning flagships, I would like to give one more honorable mention to the Elder Dragon Valstrax. This monster was the flagship monster for Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, and it is basically a dragon that is also a fighter jet. Let's be honest, this monster's design is ridiculous. Using its wings like jet boosters, it can propel itself through the sky at crazy speeds. This monster was a pretty good fit for Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, which was a rather over-the-top game that sort of served as a celebration for the rest of the series. However, I don't know how well this monster would fit in any other game. Let's not lose hope though, the team behind Generations Ultimate was also the team that worked on Rise. Also think of the potential if this monster were to be added to Rise. This monster basically uses rocket boosters to fly, and you know what else uses rocket boosters to fly? The gun lance. So what if this monster let you make a special gun lance that had an enhanced blast dash? That is really all I could ask for. Our next entry will be for 2 monsters for numbers 8 and 9. Okay, so once again we are talking about 2 monsters that have small versions in Monster Hunter Rise. For the small Jaggy monsters we have the alpha male, the Great Jaggy, and for the Jagras monsters we have the Great Jagras. Now let's be honest, these fellows don't really have the hugest reason to be added. In the case of the Great Jaggy, if you are not familiar, then you really aren't missing much. If you are familiar with Great Baggy and Great Roggy, the Great Jaggy is basically those monsters without any special abilities. For this monster to be added, it would need something else to set it apart. Perhaps it could have more of a focus on commanding the lesser Jaggy, but even then the Great Izuchi already has that aspect covered. For the Great Jagras, I would give this monster a slightly higher chance due to its more unique abilities. Also, I think this monster would be fun to see if we also got the later edition of the Greatest Jagras event, which was actually a super fun fight. Overall, these monsters have some connections to the small monsters in Rise, so they could potentially be added in a major expansion as new early game monsters. But I would still give them fairly low odds due to the existence of more interesting early game monsters. Alright, so here we are with our final monster. As a brief warning, the things I will talk about for this monster will contain spoilers for the current endgame monsters in Rise. So with that warning out of the way, this monster that I think would be a great fit for a future Rise update is the Elder Dragon Amatsu. Now with regards to the current endgame monsters, we have the pair of Serpent Elder Dragons, Wind Serpent Ibushi and Thunder Serpent Narwa. Well, it just so happens that Amatsu is also a rather serpent-like Elder Dragon that can control storms. In fact, when Ibushi was first shown in some of the trailers, a lot of folks actually mistook it for Amatsu. Now let's get into some speculation for the true ending of Monster Hunter Rise. Once again, this is spoilers for the story of Rise, but from the current ending, it was hinted that there would be a child born from Ibushi and Narwa. It would be a reasonable assumption that the true final boss would be this child, but if we wanted to speculate a step further, we might possibly guess that this child could actually be Amatsu. In my speculation, I would actually guess that it would not be Amatsu, but instead be a completely new design. My main reason for this would be the fact that traditionally, the major story monsters in these games are almost always original designs, and it may be somewhat out of place for a final story boss to just be a returning monster. Of course, on the other hand, it might be a pretty cool moment to have this be Amatsu's origin story. Now, even if this final boss isn't Amatsu, that doesn't rule out the possibility of Amatsu returning in some other update. Because Amatsu's design is so similar to the other serpents, we could see the possibility of some connection being revealed between Amatsu and the others. Perhaps it could show up as a rival monster or something like that. At any rate, Amatsu is another monster with a really cool design overall, and is one that I would love to see added to the game. And with that, we are at the end of the video. I hope you all have enjoyed. As a quick note, there are definitely more monsters that you may be thinking of that might have an even higher chance to be added to Rise. In particular, a lot of the monsters that appeared in Monster Hunter World actually have a pretty good chance due to the viability of porting them to Rise. However, for my list, I generally tried to focus on monsters that have not appeared in World. This is because I wanted to give a spotlight to some of the older monsters that players who started with World or Rise would be less familiar with. If you have any more returning monsters that you think are likely to be added or ones that you just want to see, feel free to discuss in the comments. In a few weeks from the time of making this video, we can see how accurate this list was. Although even after the 3.0 update drops, there's always the possibility of more additions in the future. So I guess that's it for now. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.